But today, France is making headlines for something very different. Its national debt. It has reached a record 3.4 trillion euros.
France is broke, not morally, that happened long ago, but financially. The nation that once dictated how others should manage their economies can't even manage its own. 3.4 trillion euros in debt, riots in the streets, governments collapsing like paper castles, and yet Paris still lectures the world about fiscal responsibility. The irony couldn't be richer. The empire that enslaved half the planet in the name of civilization is now enslaved by its own greed. France isn't falling. It's rotting, loudly, publicly, and deservedly. But how did this happen? And what does Africa have to do with it? Let's tell you the truth. There's a certain poetry to downfall, especially when it comes wrapped in arrogance. France, once the self-appointed lecturer of the world's economic morals, now finds itself on trial before the very standards it built. The numbers are no longer whispers in financial journals. They're sirens. 3.4 trillion euros in public debt. That's about 115.6% of GDP, nearly double the European Union's responsible limit. To grasp how absurd that is, imagine an African finance minister presenting a budget with that ratio. The headlines would scream, fiscal collapse. But because it's Paris, the story is softened into economic headwinds. This isn't just a line on a balance sheet. It's a slow-motion implosion decades in the making. Since 1973, France has not balanced a single budget. That's 52 years of spending beyond its means, of governing through debt instead of discipline. Every president, left, right, or centrist, has added another layer of credit on top of crumbling credibility. What once passed as economic sophistication now looks like the refined art of denial. The facade cracked first during the pandemic years. France opened the treasury floodgates, pouring billions into lockdown relief and health subsidies, an understandable move at the time. But when the pandemic faded, the spending didn't. Then came the Russian gas crisis of 2022. Paris, terrified of protests over energy bills, blanketed the population with subsidies. Billions more evaporated. What began as emergency spending hardened into political addiction. The idea that every crisis could be fixed with borrowed euros. Now the bill has arrived. Interest payments alone consume over 67 billion euros annually, more than France's entire education budget. Debt is no longer an accounting term. It's a living parasite feeding on the state. The government is stuck in a vicious loop. It borrows to pay off old borrowing, then borrows again to calm the crowds protesting against austerity. The cycle is no longer financial. It's cultural. A nation once famed for revolutions now revolts against reality itself. The political fallout has been volcanic. François Bayrou, the outgoing prime minister, tried to introduce an austerity plan to cut 44 billion euros in spending, only to be drowned out by nationwide strikes. Within weeks, he was out. The new Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, inherits a government that can barely pass a budget without sparking chaos. The streets of Paris, Marseille, and Lyon are thick with resentment. Workers furious over inflation, pensioners furious over taxes, and youth furious over unemployment. France's problem isn't just economic mismanagement. It's a population that refuses to accept the consequences of decades of comfort bought on credit. And behind the protests lies a deeper rot, one that eats at the illusion of European superiority. For years, France waved its debt around like a medal of modernity, claiming that advanced economies can manage higher leverage. That illusion died the moment its credit rating was downgraded, and its bonds began trading with the caution once reserved for struggling southern economies. Investors now whisper what Africa was once accused of: instability, unpredictability, unreliability. The contagion is psychological. A nation that believed it was immune to collapse is now tasting the fear it once exported. France's fall is not a sudden accident. It's the end of a myth that Europe's systems were built on reason, while Africa's were ruled by emotion. But today, the roles look reversed. Africa's fiscal policies are driven by necessity and self-correction, while France's are dictated by political panic. So the question now isn't how much France owes. It's what this debt truly exposes, because behind every unpaid bill lies something deeper than numbers. The moral bankruptcy of an empire that once ruled the world through its money. When France's debt crisis is stripped of numbers and graphs, what remains is the irony of a preacher caught in his own sermon. For decades, Paris dictated economic virtue to the developing world, especially Africa, as if the art of fiscal prudence was its divine inheritance. It wrote the script for austerity, poverty management, and privatization, then exported it through the International Monetary Fund and World Bank like gospel truth. But now that the same prescriptions would choke its own citizens, France has torn its own commandments to pieces. To understand this hypocrisy, you must rewind to the 1980s and 1990s, the era of structural adjustment. When African nations faced debt crises back then, they were told the problem wasn't colonial exploitation or global trade inequality. No, the fault lay in their overspending. The IMF, often nudged by French economists, demanded cuts in social programs, removal of fuel subsidies, privatization of public assets, and the opening of markets to foreign corporations, many of them French. Hospitals were gutted, education systems defunded, and currencies devalued. Millions of Africans paid the price for what Paris called discipline. Fast forward to today, and the roles are grotesquely reversed. France now finds itself in the very position it once lectured others about: overspending, fiscal indiscipline, dependency on external lenders. But instead of accepting the same bitter medicine it prescribed to Africa, it's making excuses, blaming wars, pandemics, and unique European conditions. When Africa borrowed for roads and power, it was called recklessness. When France borrows for welfare and subsidies, it's a strategic stimulus. The dictionary of hypocrisy has never read more clearly. Behind France's arrogance was always fear, the fear of losing its moral authority over its former colonies. So long as Africa looked poor, Paris could look principled. So long as African economies were painted as chaotic, France could pretend to be the voice of order. But the truth is finally catching up. The so-called African debt trap pales in comparison to the mountain France has built for itself. And unlike Africa, which borrowed for development, France borrowed to sustain decline. This double standard reveals something deeper than numbers. It exposes the psychology of empire. Colonialism didn't end, it changed form. The new chains were economic, the CFA franc, the aid programs, and the French-backed loans that ensured Africa's dependency. And when African nations protested, Paris sent economists instead of soldiers. Control was rebranded as cooperation. Oppression was renamed partnership. France's financial gospel became a subtler form of domination. We will teach you how to spend by making sure you never spend without us. Now, with its own finances imploding, that control is eroding. African leaders are watching the emperor tremble in his own palace. The same French technocrats who once drafted austerity for Dakar and Abidjan are now struggling to keep their own streets from burning. Protesters in Paris today sound eerily like the Africans France once patronized, angry at foreign dependency, furious at elite corruption, desperate for jobs, and tired of being told that suffering is for stability. So here's the bitter truth. France didn't just lose its balance sheet, it lost its credibility. When you live by double standards, collapse is not a possibility. It's destiny. For every lecture France gave on fiscal responsibility, it forgot to apply one lesson: accountability. And the price of that arrogance is now public, global, and irreversible. But the story doesn't end there. Because France's fall is not just France's problem, it's Africa's opportunity. If the old master is choking on the rules he created, then who stands ready to write the new ones? The answer lies not in Paris or Brussels, but in the capitals once dismissed as dependent: Ouagadougou, Niamey, Bamako, and Accra. The question is no longer whether Africa can lead, it's whether the world is ready to admit that it already is. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. France's crumbling economy isn't just a European story. It's the mirror Africa needed to stop doubting itself. For decades, the continent was told to emulate Europe's model of governance and finance. Follow the West, they said, and you'll prosper. But what happens when the West itself loses its map? When the self-proclaimed teacher forgets its own lessons, the students stop listening. and Africa finally has. This moment, right here, right now, marks a silent revolution in global economics. Across the continent, nations are moving away from dependency and towards designing systems that serve their people, not foreign approval. The same Africa that once stood in line at the IMF's door now builds its own alternatives. The BRICS New Development Bank, the African Export-Import Bank Afreximbank, and the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System PAPSS, all created to break the Western monopoly on credit and trade. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré embodies that defiance. When Western powers demanded reforms in exchange for loans, he said no, choosing to build with gold, not debt. His administration redirected revenue from mineral exports into food production and industrial projects. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as one of the world's poorest countries, is now supplying grain to its neighbors. Traoré's logic is simple but revolutionary. A nation that eats from its own soil will never beg. In Niger, the rejection of French control over uranium wasn't just an act of political rebellion. It was a financial declaration of independence. For decades, Paris paid pennies for the same uranium that powered its nuclear plants, while Nigerian towns sat in darkness. But after the Sahel military alliance was formed, Niger began renegotiating its contracts with the kind of confidence Africa hasn't seen in half a century. The message was clear. The age of extraction is over. The age of negotiation has begun. And then there's Mozambique, where President Daniel Chapo has championed large-scale industrial projects without surrendering national sovereignty. The Mfanda Nkua hydropower project, worth $6 billion, isn't being financed through Western loans but through multi-country partnerships that keep African interests at the center. The focus is no longer on aid, it's on agency. That shift, subtle but seismic, separates this era from everyone before it. Even in nations like Ghana, Rwanda, and Kenya, the mindset is changing. Financial literacy and domestic investment have become political movements. Young Africans are no longer asking how to borrow, they're asking how to own. The generation that grew up being told Europe knows best is now watching Europe's houses catch fire and realizing we were never the problem. This reversal of influence, from Paris to the Pan-African, is more than economic, it's psychological. France's collapse has punctured the myth of Western invincibility. The empire that built its wealth on Africa's back can no longer balance its own books, while the continent it called indisciplined is now practicing exactly the restraint and innovation the West abandoned. But this transformation didn't happen by chance, it happened by awakening. African nations learned through observation what textbooks refused to teach. Debt is not development, dependency is not partnership, lectures are not leadership. The very same crisis that's shaking Europe has become Africa's mirror of self-clarity. And yet, even as Africa rises, the world pretends not to notice. Western media downplays the shift, describing it as regional assertiveness or temporary populism. But what's really happening is deeper. It's the redefinition of global competence. The student has outgrown the teacher. Still, one question lingers. If Africa has finally stopped listening to the old masters, how will it rewrite the narrative that kept it chained for so long? Because rejecting hypocrisy is one thing, replacing it with a new standard is another. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When the teacher fails and the student takes the chalk, the first thing to change is the definition of success. For decades, the West defined stability in economic terms that suited its image: balanced budgets, low inflation, controlled deficits, while ignoring the deeper reality of justice and sustainability. Africa was always judged by those narrow Western parameters, as if a number on a spreadsheet mattered more than a full stomach or a working power grid. But as France's crisis drags Europe into anxiety, that illusion of Western stability is collapsing, and Africa is quietly rewriting what stability truly means. The turning point came when African governments began questioning the rules that never worked in their favor. For years, European economists insisted that a good economy was one that attracted foreign investment, not one that empowered local producers. That logic created nations that exported raw materials and imported everything else. But in recent years, African policymakers, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, have started flipping the formula. Real stability, they argue, isn't measured by foreign credit ratings, but by the resilience of domestic production. Take Ghana, for instance. Once crushed under IMF loan conditions, it's now pivoting towards local value chains in mining and agriculture. Ghana no longer just exports gold, it refines it. It doesn't just export cocoa, it's investing in chocolate manufacturing for domestic and regional markets. These are not mere economic choices, they're acts of liberation. The country's new financial doctrine is built on self-containment, not Western approval. Rwanda, too, offers a new definition of order. Its economy isn't built on borrowing or resource dependency, but on governance and efficiency. Kigali's focus on digital infrastructure, public accountability, and industrial parks has made it one of the most stable nations in Africa, without the cushion of French aid or European supervision. And unlike Europe, which now protests every reform, Rwandans are active participants in their transformation. Stability here is not passive, it's participatory. Even Kenya has reshaped the meaning of fiscal health. When Western analysts mocked Nairobi's public debt, Kenyan planners countered with evidence. Those loans are tied to visible projects, ports, expressways, data centers, not invisible bureaucracies. Kenya's borrowing is for expansion, not consumption. Contrast that with France, whose 3.4 trillion euro debt funds pensions, subsidies, and political promises that produce no growth. It's the difference between debt that builds and debt that buries. This is where the global conversation is shifting. The same Western nations that once used credit agencies and economic forums as tools of judgment now find themselves under scrutiny. When Fitch Ratings downgraded France, African observers noticed the poetic symmetry, the colonial grader being graded. For the first time, the myth of Western superiority is being audited by its own failures. But Africa's quiet revolution goes beyond policy, it's philosophical. The continent has started framing stability not as austerity, but as adaptability. In a world of pandemics, climate shocks, and shifting alliances, the nations that survive are not the ones with the cleanest balance sheets, but those that can pivot quickly without collapsing. Africa, forged in crisis after crisis, has become the laboratory of resilience. Whether it's Nigeria's fintech boom, Ethiopia's manufacturing drive, or Senegal's energy independence plan, African stability now rests on flexibility, something rigid European bureaucracies can no longer imitate. Meanwhile, France's paralysis reveals the curse of comfort. Europe built systems so centralized, so bureaucratic, that they can no longer evolve without breaking. Africa, by contrast, was built out of necessity, decentralized, experimental, sometimes chaotic, but alive. Where Paris debates austerity, Lagos builds startups. Where Brussels argues over reforms, Kigali implements them before breakfast. The contrast has become impossible to ignore, and yet, the world's media still frames Africa through old cliches. Emerging, volatile, unpredictable. But look closely, volatility is just another word for dynamism. Africa's volatility births innovation. Europe's rigidity breeds stagnation. This isn't a competition of continents anymore, it's a contrast of philosophies. The old one worships stability even as it rots. The new one embraces movement as strength. France's unraveling economy proves that static order is just a postponed collapse. Africa's rise shows that disorder, when guided by vision, can become evolution. When you change the definition of stability, the world eventually notices. What began as Africa's quiet correction has now become the planet's loudest reality check, because France's economic implosion didn't just expose one country's weakness, it unmasked an entire system built on illusion. The West's economic model, the same one it forced upon Africa, is proving unsustainable in its own backyard. And Africa, for the first time in centuries, is watching without flinching. The reckoning is not just financial, it's civilizational. Europe's strength once came from extracting Africa's wealth and then lecturing Africa on productivity. That cycle is now broken. The mines they controlled are being reclaimed. The currencies they printed are being replaced. The rules they wrote are being rewritten, and this time, Africa holds the pen. When Paris scrambles to plug a 3.4 trillion euro deficit, the same continent it used to call underdeveloped is investing in sovereign gold refineries, cross-border payment systems, and regional industrialization networks. Africa isn't seeking to imitate anymore. It's seeking to replace. The shift in mindset is historic. For centuries, Africa's strategy was reactionary, responding to external pressures, IMF reforms, and Western sanctions. Today, it's proactive. Instead of waiting for aid, countries are building intra-African economies that reduce exposure to foreign debt. The African Continental Free Trade Area (AfCFTA) is no longer just an agreement on paper. It's becoming a shield. It gives Africa what Europe lost: control over its own market. That means African resources, African labor, and African innovation circulating within Africa before they enrich anyone else. This transformation is shaking old powers to their core. Western economists, trained to see Africa through the lens of dependency, are suddenly finding themselves out of arguments. They can't call Africa unstable when France is on the brink of recession. They can't accuse African leaders of corruption while their own parliaments are collapsing under political scandals. They can't warn about debt traps when their own nations are living off credit cards. The hypocrisy that once fueled their authority has burned out, and with it, their credibility. But Africa's rise isn't fueled by vengeance, it's fueled by vision. The continent's leaders aren't seeking to replace Europe as the next empire. They're seeking to end the idea of empire altogether. From Burkina Faso's alliance in the Sahel to Ethiopia's infrastructure diplomacy, the new African order is built on cooperation, not coercion. It's not about who rules, it's about who builds. And that's why the West's panic feels so misplaced, because Africa's goal isn't domination, it's independence. Still, the irony is unmissable. As France begs for fiscal leniency from Brussels, African nations that were once told to tighten their belts are now lending to international markets. As the euro trembles under debt, African currencies, once pegged to it through the CFA franc, are being reconsidered for full sovereignty. What was once dismissed as impossible is now inevitable. The Black Continent is no longer a metaphor for darkness. It's the silhouette of the future rising behind a fading empire. The world is beginning to pivot toward this new gravitational pull. Russia, China, Turkey, and India have already recognized it. Even Latin America and parts of Southeast Asia are mirroring Africa's strategy, asserting local control over resources, rejecting austerity, and demanding equitable trade. Africa has become the blueprint for post-colonial resilience, the proof that endurance, when forged in fire, becomes strength. And as Europe clings to nostalgia, Africa is embracing necessity. The same necessity that forced it to survive colonization, resist manipulation, and now rise in unison. France's crisis, in that sense, is not just a fall. It's a mirror. It reflects the arrogance of a world that thought dominance was eternal and dependency was Africa's destiny. But this time, the narrative flips. When the lights dim in Paris, they flicker on in Ouagadougou. When the euro wobbles, the African Union stands taller. The torch is moving, silently but surely, from the hands of those who borrowed their power to those who earned it. And as history turns its page, one truth becomes unshakable. Africa was never behind. The world was just looking in the wrong direction. Do you still believe the West is the model the world should follow? Let us know in the comments section. If France can drown in its own debt, who really deserves to be called developing? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.